Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society. I'd like to welcome you to another lecture in the series of Mississippi and the Civil War, which was conducted at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History's Old Capitol Museum in Jackson, Mississippi in November of 1996. This wonderful series engaged a number of popular and well-known historians and introduced Parker Hills to our audience. Way back yonder 24 years ago. The next lecture that I have asked to speak deals with something that's pretty emotional to Mississippians even today, as it is for Georgians and so forth. It is the experience of the Mississippi civilians in the Civil War as encountered when they met U.S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. The challenge of understanding Sherman and understanding how the war was prosecuted is to understand that in the United States, they had not ever made war on themselves before. There had been small, insignificant insurrections, but here a whole half of the country had rebelled against the central authority and had walked out of their bonds with ordinances of secession and had formed their own country, which lived for just a little over 4 years. And so, in trying to deal with fighting a war in a country that a few years before had been a part of the United States, and dealing with people who a few years before were United States citizens and now were Confederate States citizens was a confounding and difficult proposition. Well, our next speaker, you've already been introduced to Mark Grimsely. We brought him into our Sherman's March to the Sea program that we did at the Georgia Historical Society earlier this year in 1996. And he spoke about the narrative that he had uncovered in his study of total war as practiced by William Sherman, and the degree of importance of the narrative of what Mark did. He now being a professor of history at the Ohio State University, he was at Ohio State University as a assistant professor, I believe, at the time, 24 years ago. Mark was very focused on his academic analysis and so forth, and of the super trio of Brooks Simpson, Steve Woodworth, and Mark Grimsley. All three are very scholarly, but I think the guy who probably impressed me the most with his understanding and insight was Mark. And Mark's presentation found itself being published at Oxford University Press. No lightweight in terms of academic and intellectual refereeing. So the fact that somebody like Oxford published this monograph speaks tons as to the quality and the respect that Mark's peer group has for his conclusions here. In this case, we previously had dealt with Sherman's March to the Sea. Now what we're going to look at is Sherman's operations in and around Jackson, Mississippi. Jackson suffers a hard hand of war, and if you go to it today, there are very, very few antebellum structures left. Indeed, when Sherman goes to secure Mississippi and Jackson after the surrender of Vicksburg and so forth, Jackson is burned a second time, and Sherman burns his way all the way to Meridian, Mississippi, as he goes to cut the railroad from Corinth, Mississippi, that runs all the way down to Mobile, Alabama. They previously cut the railroad at Corinth that leads from Memphis over to Chattanooga. And so in trying to hack up and parse up the Confederacy and their lines of communication and transportation, Sherman finds himself needing to go over and to basically secure the rail line that runs from Vicksburg over to Meridian and further east. as well as the rail line coming down from Memphis to Mobile, or the Mobile in Ohio, I think it is. So very strategic in terms of what they were doing. But this operation turns out to be a precursor to what Sherman will do later on, and it is also a precursor to what is known as the Lieber Plan, which is published in 1864 as General War Order Number 100, and that is the manifestation of the academic and intellectual consideration as to what was permissible in a war, in a civil war. What could you, what couldn't you do to local populaces in the war? And it dealt with the reality that that the ability of the South to wage war came from the heartland, the limited industries they had, and the produce and power capabilities that came from plantations and other means that provided resources to the armies that fed them and provided them with materials and so forth. And so the question as to how could you weaken the Confederate armies in the field had to deal with what could you legitimately and legally do to destroy the morale of the home front and to break the ability of the South to provide the weapons and provisions of war to their armies. And so consequently, the question of waging war on civilians, men, women, and children, old men and young boys, had to be dealt with. And before General War Order Number 100 was passed, Sherman showed what he envisioned general and total war to be, and that was in the path from Chimneyville in Jackson, Mississippi, all the way over to Meridian. So sit back, relax, and enjoy Mark Grimsley's presentation of the hard hand of war as relates to Mississippi.
Okay, if everybody can just hear me okay, what I'm going to do is, by and large, just walk around and talk for about half an hour or so, and then we're going to open it up for questions and answers. Now, as you just heard, I'm from Ohio State University. Here I am down in Mississippi to talk about Sherman. A few weeks ago, I had to go to Eastern North Carolina also to talk about Sherman. Of course, that's the area where Sherman's march to the Carolinas wound up. As I was getting ready to head off there, people in my department asked me, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Well, off to Greenville, North Carolina, to talk about the mythology of Sherman's march." And they looked at me as though I had volunteered to reprise the role of Ned Beatty in the film Deliverance. Not thinking it was a good idea. But I went down there, Greenville, North Carolina, to an auditorium about the size of this one, East Carolina University. And I pointed out to my audience, which included sons of Confederate veterans, and they sure had that kind of squeal like a pig look in their eye when I first got there. But I pointed out to them that I was in the very same town where my mother and father had met many years before. They had been students at East Carolina University, they had fallen in love there, they had married, they had me. My first place I ever lived was in Greenville, North Carolina. And I pointed out further that I was an 11th generation North Carolinian, and I was and I am. So when I speak about this today, I'm speaking about it as a Southern. So I spoke about it there as a Southern. Now, they were a little suspicious at first, but I could describe chapter and verse what Eastern North Carolina was like. It was plain I'd been there, it was plain I was familiar with the place. But what finally turned the screw in terms of their acceptance of me as a Southern was the following day we were on a tour of Bentonville Battlefield, and on the way we stopped at the service station, and I got myself a moon pie. And that was the final proof that I was no fake, that I really was a moon pie.
What did you bring?
Well, I would have had an RC Cola, which is the politically correct answer to that question. RC and a moon pie, or a knee-high and a moon pie, but they didn't have that. So I had to settle for Pepsi Cola with peanuts in. I don't think put peanuts in Pensacola here, but okay, but I got that. I'll swear it away. All right, okay, now that I've established my credentials, and don't have to worry about being mobbed, before I get to the end of my talk, I'm going to talk about hardcore. And it's very appropriate that we talk about this phenomenon here in Mississippi because, as you'll see from the outline of my talk and the map, Mississippi is the cradle of hardcore. This is where this federal strategy, this is where this federal dynamic began. It started. Federal policy toward Southern civilians does not begin as a hard war policy. It begins, on the contrary, with a policy that historians are going to call conciliation. In fact, it was called a conciliatory policy even back then. When the Lincoln administration and the Northerners took up arms against the South in the spring of 1861, they believed, for better or worse, accurately or inaccurately, that most white Southerners had had very little hand in the secessionist movement. They believed that a comparatively small minority of elite slaveholders, the planter class, had, through its domination of Southern political and social and economic life, taken the Confederate States individually out of the Union, cobbled together a Confederate States government, and had hoodwinked the rest of white Southerners into believing that, yes, the Lincoln administration was going to destroy slavery. Yes, the Lincoln administration favored equality for blacks. And yes, the Lincoln administration intended to tyrannize the rest of Southerners. So federal policy about it at the beginning of the war was, let's prove the diehard secessionists wrong. Let's not play into everything that other white Southerners have heard. After all, most white Southerners, just months before, they were Americans. They thought of themselves as Americans. They had fought in American wars. They had helped to create this country. Their allegiance to this newly fangled Confederate States of America cannot be very deep. If we don't do things to push them into the arms of this Confederate States government, legitimize that government, then we can win the war most easily. What we're going to do then is we're going to target the military power of the Confederate States of America. We're going to target the Southern armies. As far as the civilians are concerned, white civilians, we're not going to touch slavery. Touch slavery, we're going to alienate white Southerners, we're going to lose the border states. We're not going to go after Southern property. On the contrary, we're going to try to guard Southern property where we can, whether it's secessionists or unions or neutrals. We're going to try as far as possible to preserve constitutional rights of white Southerners within the limits of what is clearly a very well-articulated rebellion. In all respects, we're going to show the power of the federal government to crush the Southern people. We're going to show that we have the armies, we have the military strength to do it. But we're not going to do it. By this policy of forbearance, we're going to demonstrate to white Southerners they have nothing to fear. We hope to tap the Unionist sentiment among white Southerners, which the Lincoln administration, for better or worse, believed was all over the place. Lincoln himself believed that except in the state of South Carolina, there was probably not even a majority for secession anywhere else in the Confederate States. So if you could just pursue this policy of forbearance, you could bring these white Southerners, woo them back to their former allegiance. That's the policy the federal government, federal armies applied for about the first 15 months of the war. April of 1861 until about June, July of 1862. And until the early summer of 1862, this policy appeared to be working. looked very much as though the Confederate government was on its last legs. Recall that in the spring of 1862, the Confederacy endures a number of very serious defeats in rapid succession. New Orleans is gone, Nashville is gone, Western Tennessee is gone, Missouri held firmly for the Union. The Union Army is now heading into Arkansas, enclaves along the Carolina coast. By June of 1862, the Confederate government, the Confederate armies are reeling everywhere. Just one last place remains to be taken. One last army remains to be beaten. That's the army defending Richmond, the lair of the military aristocracy, military despotism. This is where the Republicans live there. They control the Confederate government. One more blow, and it'll all be over. Instead, Lee's army rebuffs the Federal army in front of Richmond. There is stalemate and then reversal in the Western theater. The Lincoln administration, in concert with the shift in federal public opinion, begins to say conciliation is not working. Coddling these white Southerners is not working. The white Southerners are showing that they're in earnest. They're playing for keeps. They have no hair split. We've got to quit our own hair split. And we're not going to guard Southern property anymore. That's played out. We're not going to let slaves be a resource for the Southern government, the Southern armies anymore. We're going to try to appropriate that resource for our own use. And in August of 1862, the Lincoln administration issues a general order encouraging federal armies, federal commanders, to take whatever property from secessionists seems to be militarily necessary to take. So that opens the parameters of what federal armies, federal commanders can do in connection with Southern civilians. And yet it takes time for Union generals to move to a hard war policy. It doesn't appear right away. Why not? Well, the key to it is what's militarily necessary. What is military necessity? As long as federal commanders believe that they can win the war primarily on the battlefield, they're not going to go after Southern property so much. Yeah, a little bit on the side and so on, but not where the key is on the battlefield. Any kind of military operation carries opportunity costs. Troops that are engaged in burning crops, confiscating livestock, and doing other kinds of destructive activities on a wide scale cannot readily be used for other purposes. So it takes time for federal commanders to move toward a policy where they want to go after Southern property, Southern crops, livestock, barns, and so forth on a wide scale. There's another problem too. Second problem is, once you get started, where does it stop? In the mid-19th century, it was common to believe that the moral universe was all of a piece, could not be casually wrenched, could not compartmentalize morality. If you got soldiers involved with taking crops from Southern civilians, that might lead to them to simply stealing from Southern civilians. Stealing is theft. Theft is morally wrong. Thievery sunders the moral universe. And ultimately, you expect these soldiers to remain moral. Moral in terms of their fidelity to duty. Moral in terms of their courage manifested on the battlefield. Many Union generals believe, many other Union officers believe, and many Confederate officers believe as well, that you've got to maintain that moral integrity. You've got to maintain that moral universe. They're reluctant. I'll give you one example. In early November 1862, this is just over the Mississippi line in Southern Tennessee, some Union soldiers came into camp one day cutting a grand splash. They'd come in with a carriage, flying carriage, drawing 4 horses, and they come on in, and they're hooting and hollering, they've taken it from some local planter. Up comes the Union officer, furious, demands they dismount. They asked him, "Who the hell are you? You don't look like our captain." And they hooted at him and hollered until it turns out that the Union officer in question was none other than Major General William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman grabs a musket from somebody, and just lucky for those guys that the musket was unloaded. As it was, he obliged them to dismount. They unharnessed the horses, and the troops that had done this thing were obliged to haul that carriage by themselves back the 2 miles down the road to the planter's house and return. As far as Sherman was concerned, this was the kind of thing that had to happen, had to be done. Otherwise, the army would soon be sunk, and the Bee no longer trust them to be faithful to their duty, no longer trust them on the battlefield. So given these inhibitions, the idea that we can win war on the battlefield, the idea that there are real problems involved with going after each other properly in a good way, why does that eventually occur? Well, what eventually carries it forward is something that might be called the logistical imperative. The idea that armies have got to supply themselves. You've got to feed there's city-sized hordes of men somehow. And in the Western theater in particular, it became difficult to do that, given the limited southern infrastructure, incursions by cavalry, breakdowns on the railroads, sniping at steamships, and just the general inefficiency of what the capabilities of a 19th century logistical effort were. It became difficult to supply all the Union soldiers simply through conventional military means, bringing supplies down from the north and distributing them. Taking food directly to the countryside became necessary ancillary expedient. But it was further. Not only did they have to take supplies from the countryside themselves sometimes, but they also noticed that the Confederate troops, Confederate armies, were themselves taking supplies from the very same countryside, supplying themselves to the countryside as well. And it became a question. If we don't take the supplies, we're going to leave for the Confederates. The Confederates are going to get them, and the Confederates will obtain sustenance thereby. So then there's two reasons there on the table right there. You need to take the supplies yourself. You want to deny them to the enemy. And the third reason is that the Lincoln administration policy is now encouraging you to take these crops whenever it's militarily necessary to do so. That gets me down to the second line. That's, to continue with this logistical imperative of Grant's overland campaign in November, December of 1862. Grant comes down northern Mississippi, expecting to get all the way to Vicksburg and get close thereby, during an overland campaign. And as Steve Woodruff described in the last ballot, Earl Van Dorn seizes his principal supply depot, Fort Supply Depot at Holly Springs, destroys it. Meanwhile, Bedford Forrest is going through western Tennessee, wrecking the railroad lines and disrupting supplies in that area. And Grant, who up until this time had sort of seen foraging as kind of an ancillary expedient, now discovers that for the sake of the survival of his army, he's got to forage, he's got to live off the countryside. No question of continuing the campaign. He's going to try to get everybody back to Memphis and its environment in one piece. To do that, they've got to live off the land. And it's probably true from the letters and diaries that Steve has seen that some Union soldiers fared badly on this return march. But what was surprising to many Union soldiers, and surprising to Grant, was that the army not only survived, but many of them feasted. And it turned out that there was enough surplus, food and forage, in that part of northern Mississippi, as far as Grant was concerned, his estimation, to have supplied an army of the size of his army for not a week or two, but for maybe as many as 60 days. This was a lesson that Grant did not soon forget. And it would reemerge when he went after Vicksburg. following spring. After the failure of Grant's overland campaign, the failure of Sherman's attempt to go after Vicksburg directly at Chickasaw Bayou, many of you know, Grant moved his entire army down to Milliken's Bend, the vicinity of Vicksburg, and spent the next several months trying to figure out how to get at Vicksburg and Pemberton's army in Vicksburg. In the meantime, the soldiers supplied themselves to some degree from the countryside directly. And they also practiced area denial, trying to keep the Confederate Army and so forth from being able to get a hold of these same supplies. In early April, for example, and this I think is item B on your map. Let's take a look at that. Brigadier General Frederick Steele took his division to Deer Creek, Mississippi, and there gathered about 1,000 horses, mules, and cattle, as well as many wagons and buggies, and burned about 500,000 bushels of corn. Now, a lot of this is area denial. But there was a second rationale at work as well, which was that this area, Deer Creek, Mississippi, and its environment, has been an area in which there had been significant guerrilla activity, particularly directed at sniping at Union steamboats along the Mississippi River. And part of the purpose of Steele's division moving into this area was punitive. It was designed to show the planters and the inhabitants, especially the planters, that if they were going to allow guerrillas to operate in their midst, they were going to pay a price for it. This is the pattern that you see over and over again with federal operations in general. You start out as foraging. Then foraging intrinsically has an effect on civilians, an intrinsic and inherent psychological impact. They don't like it. It's uncomfortable. So you can take that logistical imperative then and sharpen it and use it to achieve psychological results, political results. And to make sure that these political results were as finely honed as possible, Sherman, who commands Steele, gives Steele orders that this punishment is not to be inflicted indiscriminately, that he's supposed to go as far as possible for the secessionist planters, people that he knows is guilty, people who are wealthy, people who presumably are the most in bed with the Confederate government. They're not supposed to burn houses, they're not supposed to allow unauthorized stealing, and so forth. And in fact, Steele and Sherman both agree on this. Yet it proves harder to keep the Union troops in line. And there are a lot of depredations, a lot of petty thieving, there's a lot of not so petty thieving. And there's a lot of stealing of buggies and wagons and so forth, for personal use, sheer vandalism. Sherman and Steele wind up as far as possible trying to take some of these surplus buggies and wagons they don't need for legitimate armed purposes and trying to return them to their owners. What they're after, what they're trying to create, is severity, but a directed severity, a channel, designed to hit some segments of the white southern population harder than others. This is not indiscriminate, this is not wanted, this is violence with political purpose. Grant, meanwhile, pondered the capture of Vicksburg. This gets us down to the important part. As many of you know, we tried a number of efforts to get at Vicksburg, very difficult because of terrain and other considerations, but mostly terrain, very difficult to get on high, dry ground on the east side of the Mississippi River by which you can still go after Vicksburg. Grant tries everything. Nothing works. So finally, in desperation, pretty much desperation, sort of inspired desperation, decides to take a leaf from his experience in northern Mississippi in November and December 1862. He's going to cross his army down below Vicksburg and have the David Porter's naval flotilla ferry them across the Mississippi river south of Vicksburg. And he's going to head not toward Vicksburg directly, but east to Jackson, to this very town, to destroy the rail net on which whatever Confederate reinforcements that might come to Vicksburg, this is the rail net through, this is the conduit by which they would reach Vicksburg. This has to be taken out first. They can't hope in a maneuver like this to use conventional supply arms. Yes, it carries along its own ammunition. Yes, they carry along some crackers. They carry along some coffee, some other things. Yes, from time to time, a supply train, heavily guarded, comes up along with it. But most troops have got to rely on the countryside for supply. And they do. And it works. And by moving on ahead and by beating the Confederate detachment sent against him promptly, Grant, in short order, is able to get into Jackson, destroy this rail center, and then head on to Vicksburg. It's getting into Jackson because this is the first of the two Jackson break-ins. When his army enters Jackson on May 14th, Grant decides he can't hold Jackson. So he elects instead to destroy his war-related factories and wreck the railroad net in the area so as to hamstring Joe Johnston's forces if Joe Johnston tried to return to the town. He gave Sherman explicit instructions on May 14th. Designate a brigade from your command to guard the city, collect stores and forage, and collect all public property of the enemy. Direct troops to commence immediately the effectual destruction of the river railroad bridge and the road as far as possible east as well as north and south. Troops going east of the river should destroy all CSA cotton and stores they find. Sherman promptly complied with these instructions and gave specific orders for the destruction of the railroads to be so complete that the Southerners would not easily be able to repair it. What he had his troops do, and I think many of you will know this, is take those railroad rails and not just tear them up, which is something you could easily repair, but to heat them, warp them, twist them, so that it would take the efforts of a rolling mill to get them fit for use again. And if you're curious to see what this looks like, go down to the fourth room of the Capitol Museum, because there's an example of what they used to call Sherman's neckties. This was done as thoroughly as they could manage it in this final available. The brigade assigned to guard the town was instructed by Sherman to destroy everything public not needed by us, including types, printing presses, and sugar. The town's arsenals, Confederate government foundry, and a factory for making gun carriages went up in smoke. Sherman also elected to destroy the very valuable cotton factory. At the same time, Sherman was irked, didn't like it, was instead irked by the fact that some of his troops were using this occasion to indulge in unauthorized destruction, vandalism, and thievery. And despite Sherman's orders forbidding arson, at least 2 unauthorized fires occurred. The major one occurred this way. Just as Sherman was leaving the town, a very fat man, Sherman's words, came to him and pleaded with Sherman not to burn his hotel. Don't burn my hotel. There it is, it's my hotel. Don't burn it. I'm a good union man. Sherman said, well, it's obvious that you're a good union man by the name of your hotel, the Confederate Hotel. Okay? But don't worry about it. It's not going to burn it. It's not being used by the Confederate government, not part of the war sources of the Confederacy. You're not making anything there that's bad. And keep your Confederate hotel, good union man. Turned out some of the Union soldiers had a grudge against this same hotel. Apparently they had once been POWs and had gone through Jackson, and they had an experience with this guy they didn't like. And so on their own hook, they destroyed the Confederate hotel. All right. After burning Jackson's war manufactories, Grant's army turns west, seizes Vicksburg, captures it, falls July 4th. Then, as soon as the city falls, Grant orders Sherman to go back to Jackson, back to Vicksburg town, and to complete the destruction of Confederate resources in this area that had been begun in May. Sherman comes back and does it. Now, gets back to Jackson, throws Joe Johnston's army, which is returned to the town, out of it, breaks the railroad again, even more extensively for 15, 20 miles out in every direction. Absolutely strips the countryside of crops and livestock, with Sherman's words, absolutely strips. This is something new. When you think about it, this is something new. This second Jackson raid, this is the birth of hard war. This is the birth of substantial, sizable federal efforts to destroy Southern economic infrastructure independently of any battlefield, objective. The first Jackson raid, think of the contrast here. The first Jackson raid is designed basically to cripple, hamstring Joe Johnston's army so it can't interfere with the conventional military effort against Vicksburg. It's economic warfare, but it's economic warfare with a specific and a very closely related conventional military purpose. This is something different. Joe Johnston's army is going away. It's not coming back. It doesn't pose any immediate danger at all. Vicksburg is following. In conventional military terms, very little needs to be done. And yet Grant's army, Grant sends Sherman back to destroy this area's economic potential as completely as possible without significant other factors at work. It was done with a thoroughness unusual, if not altogether unprecedented. Sherman's orders emphasized, as they have always emphasized, the need to do this with restraint, the need to destroy war-related resources, not indulge in arson, not indulge in petty thievery, and not to molest private homes, and this kind of thing. What's interesting to me is in the first Jackson raid in May, by and large, this holds up reasonably well. A couple of instances of unauthorized arson, but not a lot. Not what you would really expect. Not on the scale that you would expect. The second raid, in July of 1863, though, there's a brigade in town to defend it, to guard it, and so forth, and yet despite this, there is significant arson, unauthorized. A significant chunk of the town burned. Something has changed. It's not Sherman's orders. It was instead the attitude of the rank and file. When the Northern soldiers entered the town, they discovered a number of torpedoes, landmines, in essence. Because they viewed this form of war as illegitimate, they were in a mood to punish somebody for it. Secondly, at about the same time that this raid is underway, Confederate cavalry under John Hunt Morgan are raiding through southern Indiana and southern Ohio. It's plain from the letters and diaries of some Union soldiers that they felt like, from here on out, because Morgan's troops have been through our area, we've heard about them burning barns and so forth, we're going to carry matches with us for the rest of the war. So that changes too. The assistant provost marshal in charge of the town writes despairingly of his efforts to prevent these cases of arson put out the palms. Many of the houses, I regret to say, were set on fire by our men, and many excesses were committed by them in pillaging and plundering. The Army acted more as a mob than as disciplined soldiers. Assistant Provost Marshal went on to say that really, when we broke it right down, only 20 to 30 men from each regiment actually conducting these kinds of activities. The 20 to 30 men from each regiment adds up. And this comparatively small percentage of the Union forces, the assistant provost marshal's force, disgraced our army. It's the second Jackson War that really inaugurates hard war. War against Southern economic infrastructure. Official Union policy still wants this war to be waged as far as possible in a discriminating, proportional manner, to fall more heavily on public property than private, to fall more heavily on the property of secessionists than the property of those who are Unionist or neutral or passive. But it's there, hard war. The ensuing problem from this point on out, is how to conduct this kind of warfare without unleashing a wave of depredations in its train. The last couple of points I want to make today concern what happens afterwards. I'll take about 5 minutes to do it, and we'll open the floor to questions. The first thing is that what you would expect, now that the hard war is out, is that the very next thing that Grant would do and Sherman would do and so forth would be to continue and make the war very hard on the Southern civilians. Instead, something interesting happens. They back off. They back way off from it. Rightly or wrongly, correctly or incorrectly, they see in central Mississippi, in the aftermath of the defeat at Vicksburg, they see evidence, they perceive it, evidence that white Southerners are losing faith in the struggle, that they're becoming demoralized, that they're maybe interested in reaching some kind of accommodation with the federal government. There's a few petitions to this effect, and they think they see evidence of it in other respects. They're right or wrong, who knows? They perceive it that way. And Grant's orders on the subject of foraging now say that if you're going to forage, it has to be authorized at corps level or higher. No captain, no colonel, no brigade commander, no division commander can authorize it. Any of these things are unauthorized and wrong and will be punished. Sherman punishes the court marshals who are caught doing this. Has to be authorized at corps level or higher. These orders are virtually identical to those of Union General George B. McClellan. He was the commander of the Army of the Potomac. He was one of probably the most conservative commanding the war produced in that respect. Grant's orders just like it. Moreover, they've gone through this area during the Vicksburg campaign, taking crops and forage and so forth from Southern civilians, and now they go back through distributing rations, trying to make sure that these Southern civilians are basically in decent shape. Trying to modulate this violence. The final point to make has to do with the Meridian expedition in February of 1864. That's the last of the arrows heading east from Vicksburg toward the Meridian. This is a raid, it's an Army-sized raid. It's conducted by William T. Sherman. And it's conducted with a view. We're going to Meridian. It's an area where it's an intersection of two railroads. There are warehouses, there are stores, there are several important war factories. Sherman wants to eliminate these. He's not going to hold Meridian permanently. All he wants to do is raid, destroy those crops at Meridian, and then move on. This introduces, first on a large scale, something that will characterize federal strategy in the balance of the war. It's a strategy Herman Hathaway and his fellow historian Archer Jones have called the strategy of raids. The idea that the South is so large, Southern territory is so sweeping, that you couldn't hope to occupy all of it conventionally. So you're not going to try. Hold certain strategic key purposes, or key points. You'll go after the Confederate armies, and then get at the rest of the South's economic resources. You don't go and occupy it. No, you go and you destroy it. And it is this policy, this pattern, that is the pattern that the Federal Army follows for the balance of the war. And it begins here, in central Mississippi, the cradle heart. Yeah.
Why do you think the conciliatory policy didn't work?
From a federal vantage point, it doesn't work because it doesn't produce what it's expected to produce. It doesn't produce a wave of Southern Unionist sentiment that manifests itself in terms of some kind of coherent opposition to the Confederate States government. That's one thing.
I understand.
Okay.
What underlying cause? Why did the Southern middle class or why didn't they not? Or what is your opinion? Why they did not?
Yeah. That is a really good question because it gets at the strength of Confederate will and the allegiance, the strength of that allegiance between the rank and file Southerner, white Southerner, and the Confederate government. And that is something that, frankly, is one of the hot issues among Civil War historians. In fact,
Is it not true that they even got more determined as a result of this?
I don't think so. I don't think that's more determined as a result of it, although you can make that argument that strategic bombing in World War II, for example, seems to have increased determination rather than broken will. But what he's talking about, why he says this is a good question, and it is, and a hard one to answer, because the professional historians are all arguing about it these days. It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. There was Confederate will. So those of us who say, and Mark are both among them, that it was ultimately a diminishable commodity, are not trying to say that there wasn't any Confederate will. We're trying to say that it was a diminishable commodity.
Well, I mean, I have my own idea, and I think, as opposed to some historians, I don't believe slavery is a big issue. I think back much further in American history than, those issues. I'm not going to...
Well, it includes that, to be sure. It's an ideological thing. But you see, as somebody said yesterday on the bus, how do you explain the intense Southern Americanism of recent times, and actually not so recent, well, because Southerners were both Southerners and Confederates and Americans, and that had something to do with making the Confederate will a relatively easy thing. They were Southerners, but what they really wanted to be was Americaners made right.
I'll tell you what, I'd like to go back to that question of Confederate morale. We'll take some of the questions first.
My question is kind of a prelude and a follow-up to this little discussion. I was going to ask you, who were the decision makers in the Lincoln administration who came to that conclusion? And in reference to what you just said here, how could they be so deluded?
Okay. First of all, I don't think that that the Federal War effort was so centralized that it was a conclusion that that Lincoln and Stanton came to, and then they sort of enforced it with everybody else. The Federal War effort was really a pretty widely flung, loose-jointed, ramshackle affair by modern 20th century standards, and it was a conclusion that a lot of people came to very rapidly about the same time that Richmond fell. I was just fascinated with this because when Richmond does not fall in the spring and summer of 62, you look at people's letters, the letters of Union soldiers and their diaries. You look at informed public opinion as expressed in the newspapers. You look at the letters and diaries of civilians. You look at the letters and diaries of Northern policymakers. And with very few exceptions, even those who have tolerated or embraced conciliation this time suddenly turn against it in a very short period of time, just a matter of weeks. And so I think that, as it turns out, it's certainly true that Lincoln turns away from conciliation, Stanton does too, and so forth, but in fact, a very wide segment of more of the civilian population and the northern high military command and the northern rank and file of the soldiers turned against him at the same time as well.
I'm sorry, you misunderstood my question. I mean, how did they reach the conclusion that conciliation was the way to go in the first place?
Oh.
Not how did they reach the conclusion it was wrong.
Okay. They reached the conclusion, basically,
And
by...
who were they? Who were the people that influenced that decision in the Lincoln administration?
Okay, once again, there's a broadly based Republican critique, but not exclusive Republican critique of what's going on in the American South. It really gets underway. You see it emerge full-blown, certainly by the middle of the 1850s. The idea that there is what they used to call a slave power conspiracy that had this kind of disproportionate control over Southern political, social, and economic life, because of its wealth in slavery and all that portended. So this is an idea that goes back well before the Civil War, and it's very finely articulated. And when the Republicans, or the incipient Republicans in the mid-1850s, look at the tendency of Southern political policy while they're still within the Union, and the policy initiatives that Southerners pursue, and what Southerners want to have happen, and so forth, they believe they see evidence, clear evidence, of this kind of slave power conspiracy. When it walks like a duck, looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And so they come into the war with this belief. It's almost an a priori assumption that, of course, these secessionists are minority. And when you think about it, this makes it a lot easier to go after the rebellion. I mean, not quite 100 years before, another group of Americans, that everybody can look back to, had invoked the right of revolution, had thrown off the shackles of a tyrannical government, and had exercised their right of self-determination by leaving the British Empire. If you want to, and Southerners, white Southerners were saying, for better or worse, we're doing the same thing. We're availing ourselves of the same right. Well, if you're a Northern and you still embrace that revolutionary heritage, but you still think that this Southern rebellion has to be stopped, then you want to believe. In fact, to some degree, you need to believe. But this is not a sovereign people asserting their right in revolution, but instead kind of a conspiracy, a large-scale conspiracy, a minority tyrannizing the majority. Yes?
I think one of the reasons, probably the fundamental reason for that, lies in not only America's revolutionary history, but in our frontier history. Virginians were, in the Anglo-American point of view, the first Americans. Virginians led the revolutionary movement. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, did not believe in slavery. Washington was the premier leader of the American nation at that time. Southerners were on the cutting edge of the American frontier. Into the period of the Mexican War, in fact, Southern culture expanded from the eastern seaboard, not only into the Mississippi West, the lower Mississippi Valley, but into southern portions of Illinois and Indiana. And they were always Americans first, Southerners, but expanding the ideals of American democracy. And it wasn't until the 1830s, after the Nat Turner Rebellion, that white Southerners became paranoid about slavery and closed off debate on the slavery issue. And even during the war, there was still a lot of Unionist sympathy. So I think it's understandable that, given all of that in the background, and then also the, in my mind, shameful Southern expansionism in the antebellum period vis-a-vis Mexico, Latin America, Cuba, that the Northern interest would believe this was a slaveocracy trying to expand, so that this slavery-oriented Southern nationalism. So, and they, it would be natural to believe that the average American Southerner wouldn't believe in this.
Yeah, that's a good brief critique of what's going on. There are two questions out here, and then I know you're waiting for a while, so take you and then you, and then move on.
Congress has passed concessions and initially decided to veto a national assembly veto Mexican. What is your thought about the interplay between, say, the congressional pressure for the quote hard war, how that interplay with the
The Second Confiscation Act, which was passed in July of 1862, after, it sort of passes constitutional muster in Lincoln class, it's got a little problem with it, is a signal, to a very strong signal by the U.S. Congress to abandon conciliation. And it's also used as a kind of an opening wedge by the Congress in the direction of emancipation. There's an emancipation provision in it. The problem with this congressional legislation, and by the way, it's on the books, but it is never widely used. I think the main scholar on this subject has concluded that even by the end of the war, there's something in the order of $110,000 worth of property is actually taken through operation of the Second Confiscation Act. The problem with it is that it requires due process of law. Are you a secessionist? Are you in revolt against the American government? Fine, put you on trial. Which takes time, costs money, and so forth. Go through a court proceeding, and then we can take your property and slave or some of your other property away from you, but only then. As a militarily efficacious measure, it's really not so good as a signal to the military, knock off this kick war group. Absolutely. I mean, it's a signal the way that Lincoln's August executive order is a signal, and the way the preliminary emancipation proclamation is certainly a signal as well.
I was going to